The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, when the earth itself seemed to shudder. Through the fog came the thunderous roar of 850 German artillery pieces, their shells screaming death across the American lines. What followed would become known as Hitler's last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment jerked awake in his command post as the barrage began. The veteran officer had seen action across Europe, but nothing had prepared him for the fury unleashing itself upon the Ardennes through his field telephone. Desperate voices crackled with reports of massive German formations materializing from the forest like ghosts given flesh. The Wehrmacht's Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, had achieved what many thought impossible. 3 entire armies, the 5th Panzer Army, 6th Panzer Army, and 7th Army, totaling over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, had assembled in complete secrecy. Operation Watch on the Rhine, as the Germans called it, aimed to split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and potentially force a separate peace with the Western Allies. Private First Class James Morrison of the 28th Infantry Division huddled in his foxhole as German Tiger tanks rumbled past his position. The 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa had been writing a letter to his sweetheart when the world exploded around him. Now, separated from his unit and armed only with his M1 Garand rifle and a handful of ammunition, he watched in terror as Panzer Grenadiers advanced through the snow-laden pines. The initial assault caught the Americans completely off guard. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group had positioned only 4 divisions along the supposedly quiet Ardennes sector, considering it unsuitable for major offensive operations. This assessment, shared by most Allied commanders, would prove catastrophically wrong, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis in Band of Brothers. The American forces in the region were either green troops getting their first taste of combat or battle-weary veterans supposedly resting in a peaceful sector. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the 1st Army, received the first fragmentary reports with skepticism. Surely this was merely a local counterattack, not the massive offensive his intelligence officers were beginning to describe. But as communications lines were severed and entire regiments went silent, the horrifying reality became undeniable. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise along an 85-mile front. In the village of Landsereth, 18 men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment found themselves facing an entire German division, led by Lieutenant Lyle Boak Jr. These soldiers would hold their position for nearly 20 hours, inflicting hundreds of casualties and significantly delaying the German advance. Their heroic stand exemplified the individual acts of courage that would characterize the American response to Hitler's surprise offensive. The German plan was audacious in its scope. Seize the Meuse River crossings, capture the fuel depots at and drive through to Antwerp within 7 days. Success would trap for Allied armies and potentially knock the Western Allies out of the war, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the advancing Soviets. But the plan depended on speed, surprise, and capturing Allied fuel supplies, for the German war machine was running on empty. As darkness fell on that first terrible day, American resistance began to stiffen despite the chaos. Isolated units fought desperate holding actions, buying precious time with their blood. By December 19, 1944, the German offensive had torn a massive bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its eventual name. Panic spread through Allied headquarters as reports streamed in of American units surrounded, scattered, or simply vanishing into the winter landscape. Yet amid this chaos, one name began to echo with defiant resolve. General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division received his orders with characteristic bluntness. The veteran paratrooper was to take his division to the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne and hold it at all costs. The strategic importance of this small town could not be overstated. 7 major roads converged there, making it essential for German supply lines and troop movements. The race for Bastogne had begun. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, McAuliffe's operations officer, coordinated the desperate airlift of the 101st Airborne from their rest areas around Reims. These were the same paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and had fought through the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. Now they faced perhaps their greatest challenge. Sergeant Bill Garner of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, looked out at the frozen landscape surrounding Bastogne as his unit dug in. The Philadelphia native had already lost friends at Normandy and in Holland, but something about this fight felt different, more desperate, more final. The Germans were throwing everything they had at them, and ammunition was running dangerously low. As German forces of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel encircled the town, the siege of Bastogne began in earnest. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the Panzer-Lehr Division tightened their grip around the American perimeter. Inside the pocket, nearly 12,000 American soldiers prepared for what might be their final battle. The weather proved as deadly an enemy as the marked temperatures plummeted to near zero, and thick clouds prevented Allied air support from reaching the besieged garrison. Frostbite casualties mounted alongside those from German artillery and small arms fire. Medical supplies dwindled, and the wounded lay in overcrowded aid stations without proper heating or adequate treatment. Private First Class Donald Hubler of the 506th Regiment accidentally shot himself in the leg while cleaning a captured German pistol. But even this self-inflicted wound could not be properly treated due to the lack of medical supplies. His death from blood loss exemplified the desperate conditions inside the Bastogne perimeter. As documented in extensive interviews conducted by historian Stephen Ambrose for his seminal work on the airborne divisions, on December 22nd, German negotiators approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum from Lieutenant General Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message demanded immediate surrender, threatening annihilation if the Americans refused. The German envoys were blindfolded and led to McAuliffe's headquarters in the Belgian army barracks. McAuliffe's response became legendary. After reading the German ultimatum, he crumpled it up and tossed it in a wastebasket. When asked for his official reply, the general uttered a single word: nuts. Colonel Joseph Harper, tasked with delivering the response, had to explain to the confused German officers that it meant go to hell. The psychological impact of McAuliffe's defiant response rippled through both armies. For the Americans, it crystallized their determination to hold at all costs. For the Germans, it signaled that this would not be the easy victory they had anticipated. The siege would continue, but the defenders of Bastogne had shown they would not break. Word of the nuts response spread rapidly through Allied forces and eventually reached the press, becoming a rallying cry for American resistance. But inside the perimeter, the situation remained desperate as German attacks intensified and supplies dwindled to critical levels. While Bastogne held against overwhelming odds, one of World War II's most controversial and brilliant generals was orchestrating what many consider his finest hour. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army, received an urgent summons to Luxembourg City on December 19, 1944. The scene in the Supreme Allied Command headquarters was one of barely controlled chaos. General Dwight David Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, faced the greatest crisis of his military career. The German offensive had caught the Allies completely off guard, and now enemy spearheads were driving toward the Meuse River, threatening to split his forces in two. Patton strode into the emergency conference with his characteristic swagger, ivory-handled pistols gleaming at his sides, while other commanders struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the German breakthrough. Patton had already begun planning his response. His Third Army was engaged in operations near the Saar River, but he understood immediately what needed to be done. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," Patton declared, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Eisenhower was not amused by such bravado, but he needed Patton's aggressive spirit and tactical genius now more than ever. The challenge facing Patton was unprecedented in modern warfare. He needed to disengage 3 entire divisions from active combat, rotate them 90 degrees, and march them over 100 miles through winter weather to attack the southern flank of the German salient. Military experts considered such a maneuver impossible to execute in less than 3 weeks. Patton promised to attack in 72 hours. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's intelligence officer, had been among the few Allied officers who had predicted the possibility of a German offensive in the Ardennes. His detailed analysis of German troop movements and wireless intercepts had been largely dismissed by higher headquarters, but Patton had listened. Now, as the Third Army began its historic pivot northward, Koch's intelligence proved invaluable. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, spearheaded Patton's relief effort. These Sherman tank crews had fought across France and into Germany, earning a reputation as one of the finest armored formations in the European theater of operations. Now they faced their greatest test, racing through snow-covered roads to reach the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Staff Sergeant Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion became the tip of Patton's spear, the hard-charging tank commander, who would later become a full general and Army Chief of Staff, pushed his Sherman through the Belgian countryside with relentless determination. Behind him, the entire 4th Armored Division stretched along the icy roads, a steel serpent winding toward battle. As referenced in Carlo d'Este's definitive biography, Patton, a genius for war, the general's ability to rapidly redeploy large formations demonstrated a level of operational art rarely seen in modern warfare. Within hours of receiving his orders, Patton had set in motion the movement of over 100,000 men and their equipment. The logistics of this operation was staggering. Fuel trucks struggled through snow and ice to keep the advancing columns moving. Ammunition convoys fought their way forward under constant threat of German air attack. Medical units prepared for massive casualties as the Third Army prepared to smash into the southern flank of the German salient. By December 22nd, advance elements of the 4th Armored Division were engaging German positions south of Bastogne. The race to relieve the besieged garrison had begun in earnest, with Patton's forces driving north, while German reserves rushed south to contain them. The weather remained a critical factor, grounding Allied air support and turning roads into treacherous ice-covered tracks. But Patton's men pressed forward, knowing that time was running out for their surrounded comrades in Bastogne. Christmas Eve 1944 dawned clear and cold across the Ardennes battlefield. For the first time in over a week, Allied pilots could see the ground beneath them as they prepared for what would become one of the most decisive air campaigns of the European war. The weather, which had been Germany's greatest ally, was about to become their deadliest enemy. Colonel Francis Gabreski, leading the 56th Fighter Group, gazed down at the snow-covered landscape from his P-47 Thunderbolt cockpit. The veteran ace had already shot down 31 German aircraft, making him one of the leading American pilots in Europe. Now, with unlimited targets spread across the Belgian countryside, he and his fellow pilots prepared to unleash hell upon the exposed German columns. The Luftwaffe's last great effort began simultaneously. Operation Baseplate, a desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground, saw nearly 1,000 German aircraft take to the skies. However, the German pilots, many with minimal training due to fuel shortages, faced experienced Allied veterans who had been fighting in European skies for years. Major Richard Bong, America's leading ace with 40 confirmed victories, led a formation of P-51 Mustangs in sweeping attacks against German airfields. The sky above the Ardennes erupted into a massive aerial battle as Messerschmitt 190s and Focke-Wulf 190s clashed with American and British fighters in what historians would later call the Great Blow. On the ground, the improved weather conditions allowed Allied artillery to adjust their fire more effectively. Colonel Anthony McAuliffe, still commanding the defense of Bastogne, watched with satisfaction as American and British artillery began systematically destroying German positions that had been hidden by the previous week's overcast conditions. The siege of Bastogne was entering its final phase, but the costs had been enormous. The 101st Airborne Division had suffered over 2,000 casualties, and ammunition shortages remained critical. However, morale soared as C-47 transport aircraft began dropping supplies directly into the surrounded perimeter. Lieutenant Charles Hanley, a pathfinder with the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, coordinated the supply drops with colored panels laid out in the snow. Each successful drop brought desperately needed medical supplies, ammunition, and food to the defenders. But German flak guns claimed a terrible toll on the slow-moving transport aircraft, with several C-47s shot down in flames over the drop zones, as chronicled in Charles MacDonald's official Army history at Time for Trumpets. The clear weather on December 24th marked the turning point of the entire battle. Allied air superiority, which had been negated by poor visibility, reasserted itself with devastating effectiveness. The German offensive, which had relied on secrecy and weather protection, now found itself completely exposed. Panzer columns that had advanced rapidly through the forest now crawled along roads under constant air attack. The Luftwaffe, despite its desperate effort in Operation Baseplate, could not protect German ground forces from the Allied air armada. Brigadier General James Morris Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division watched from his command post as wave after wave of Allied bombers passed overhead. The former regimental commander who had jumped into Sicily, Italy, and Normandy understood that the tide of battle was shifting. His paratroopers, fighting desperately to hold the northern shoulder of the German penetration, could hear the bombs exploding on German positions miles away. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had advanced confidently through the fog now found themselves pinned down by relentless air attacks. Supply convoys that had moved freely under cover of clouds were decimated by roving fighter bombers. The initiative, which Germany had seized so dramatically a week earlier, was slipping away. By Christmas Day, 1944, the German offensive had reached its high water mark and begun to recede. The weather, which Hitler had counted on to shield his forces, had cleared at the worst possible moment for the Wehrmacht. December 26, 1944, would be remembered as one of the most dramatic days in American military history. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Charles Bogus of the 7th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, stood in the turret of his Sherman tank and shouted across the frozen landscape, "Come here, this is the 4th Armored." The response came immediately from a nearby foxhole. "I'm Lieutenant Webster of the 326 Engineers, 101st Airborne. Glad to see you." The siege of Bastogne was over. General George Patton had delivered on his impossible promise. In exactly 100 hours from receiving his orders, his Third Army had disengaged from combat, marched over 100 miles through winter conditions, and smashed through German defenses to relieve the surrounded garrison. Military historians would later call it one of the most brilliant maneuvers in the history of warfare. The breakthrough had cost Patton's forces dearly. The 4th Armored Division suffered over 1,000 casualties in their desperate drive to reach Bastogne, with entire tank companies reduced to mere handfuls of operational vehicles. But they had accomplished the impossible, maintaining the strategic crossroads that controlled German supply lines throughout the region. Staff Sergeant Creighton Abrams, whose tank had spearheaded the final assault, climbed down from his Sherman to embrace the exhausted paratroopers who emerged from their foxholes. These men had held out for 7 days against overwhelming odds, surviving constant artillery bombardment, infantry attacks, and sub-zero temperatures that had claimed hundreds of casualties to frostbite alone. Inside Bastogne, General Anthony McAuliffe surveyed the devastation wrought by a week of intense combat. The town lay in ruins, its buildings shattered by artillery and air attacks. The civilian population had huddled in basements throughout the siege, with many becoming casualties despite the efforts of American medics to protect them. The 101st Airborne Division had been bled white defending the perimeter, but their sacrifice had strategic consequences far beyond the tactical situation. By holding Bastogne, they had denied German forces the road network essential for rapid movement and supply. This forced German commanders to commit reserves piecemeal, and prevented the coordinated advance that might have reached the Meuse River, as documented in John Toland's comprehensive study battle. The story of the Bulge. The relief of Bastogne marked the psychological turning point of Hitler's last offensive. German soldiers who had initially advanced with confidence born of early success now realized that American resistance was stiffening everywhere along the front. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, had invested enormous resources in the capture of Bastogne. Elite divisions including the Panzer Lehr and elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had been committed to reducing the American perimeter. Their failure to capture the town before Patton's arrival meant that these irreplaceable formations were now trapped between the anvil of Bastogne's defenders and the hammer of the Third Army's advance. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, German commander in the West, had already begun recommending withdrawal from the Ardennes salient. The old Prussian officer understood that the offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives, and that continuing the attack would only result in the destruction of Germany's last mobile reserves. However, Adolf Hitler refused to consider retreat. From his headquarters in the Wolf's Lair, the Nazi leader demanded that his forces continue attacking despite mounting evidence that the operation had failed. The relief of Bastogne had broken the back of the German offensive, but the battle was far from over. Allied commanders now prepared to eliminate the salient entirely, trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers and destroying Hitler's last hope for victory in the West. January 3, 1945, marked the beginning of the end for German forces trapped in the Ardennes salient. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, launched Operation Veritable from the north, while General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group attacked from the south. The massive Allied counteroffensive would eliminate the Bulge and destroy Germany's last strategic reserve in Western Europe. Lieutenant General Joseph Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, had been planning this moment since the German breakthrough began. Lightning Joe Collins, as his troops called him, understood that the Wehrmacht forces in the salient were overextended and vulnerable to a coordinated pincer movement that would trap them against the advancing Soviet armies in the east. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, spearheaded Collins's attack from positions around Spa, Belgium. These veteran soldiers had fought from North Africa through Sicily, Normandy, and across Western Europe. Now they faced German troops who were exhausted, short of supplies, and increasingly demoralized by the failure of their offensive. Colonel George Taylor, commanding the 16th Infantry Regiment, watched his men advance through the same forests where German forces had achieved such devastating surprise 3 weeks earlier. The psychological transformation was complete. American forces now held the initiative, while German units fought desperate rearguard actions to avoid encirclement. The weather continued to favor Allied operations. Clear skies allowed constant air support, while frozen ground permitted cross-country movement that would have been impossible during normal winter conditions. The 9th Air Force, commanded by Major General Elwood Quesada, flew over 2,000 sorties daily, systematically destroying German vehicles, supply depots, and communication centers. German resistance varied dramatically across the front. SS Panzer divisions, indoctrinated with Nazi fanaticism, fought with desperate courage even as their situation became hopeless. Regular Wehrmacht units, composed largely of older men and teenagers, often surrendered rather than continue a battle they understood was lost. The 2nd Armored Division, known as Hell on Wheels, achieved one of the most dramatic victories of the counteroffensive under Major General Ernest Harman. They surrounded and destroyed much of the 2nd Panzer Division near Celles, Belgium. Over 80 German tanks were captured or destroyed, along with hundreds of vehicles and thousands of prisoners. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commanding a Sherman tank in the 3rd Armored Division, personified the American armored renaissance that followed the dark days of December. Poole and his crew had destroyed over 10 German tanks during the Battle of the Bulge, demonstrating tactical improvements that made American armor increasingly effective against veteran German formations. The German withdrawal quickly became a rout. Units that had advanced confidently 3 weeks earlier now struggled to escape Allied encirclement. Fuel shortages, which had plagued German operations from the beginning, became critical as supply lines stretched back through devastated terrain under constant air attack. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, recognized that his forces faced complete destruction if they remained in the salient. Despite Hitler's orders to hold at all costs, Model began organizing a fighting withdrawal that might preserve some remnant of his command for future operations. As referenced in Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, the German withdrawal was marked by increasing desperation and declining discipline. Elite SS formations that had spearheaded the offensive now protected the retreat of regular army units. Reversing the normal tactical relationship between these forces, the human cost of the counteroffensive was staggering for both sides. American divisions that had been rebuilt after earlier battles found themselves again reduced to skeleton strength. German casualties were even heavier, with entire regiments ceasing to exist as organized units. The Wehrmacht was bleeding to death in the Ardennes forests. By January 15, German forces that had advanced to within miles of the Meuse River were now fighting desperately to escape back across the German border. January 28, 1945, witnessed the official end of the Battle of the Bulge. As American forces reached the original front, lines established before the German offensive began. What Hitler had envisioned as Germany's last chance for victory in the West had become the Wehrmacht's final catastrophe, costing the Reich its last mobile reserves and sealing the fate of the Third Reich. The statistical magnitude of the defeat was staggering. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, including many irreplaceable veterans and officers. Over 800 tanks and assault guns had been destroyed or abandoned, representing nearly half of Germany's remaining armored strength in Western Europe. The Luftwaffe had lost over 1,000 aircraft in its desperate gamble, effectively ending its existence as a fighting force. American casualties were also severe, with over 80,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the 6-week battle. However, unlike German losses, American casualties could be replaced. The industrial might of the United States continued to pour men and equipment into Europe, while Germany's resources dwindled toward extinction. General Dwight Eisenhower surveyed the devastated Ardennes landscape with mixed emotions. The battle had tested his leadership more severely than any previous challenge, forcing difficult decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. The unity of his Allied coalition had been strained by the crisis, but ultimately the bonds forged in earlier victories had held firm. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond military considerations. For the American people, the initial shock of the German offensive had given way to pride in their soldiers' resilience and determination. Stories of heroism at Bastogne, individual acts of courage throughout the forest, and Patton's dramatic relief march had captured the public imagination. For Germany, the failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the beginning of the end. Hitler's gamble had consumed the last reserves that might have prolonged the war or negotiated better surrender terms. Now, with Soviet armies advancing from the east and Allied forces massing for their final offensive in the west, the Reich faced inevitable destruction. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, initially suspicious that the Western Allies might negotiate a separate peace with Germany, now understood that no such possibility existed. The failure of Hitler's offensive had eliminated any chance of splitting the Allied coalition, ensuring that Germany would face defeat on all fronts simultaneously. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, dismissed by Hitler after advocating withdrawal from the Ardennes, later reflected on the battle's significance. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was the death knell of the German army in the West. After that, we could only delay the inevitable. His assessment proved prophetic as German forces crumbled under the final Allied onslaught. The technological lessons learned during the battle would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The decisive role of air power, the importance of logistics and supply lines, and the value of combined arms tactics were all demonstrated conclusively during the fighting. These lessons would be studied in military academies worldwide and applied in future conflicts. For the individual soldiers who survived the battle, the experience created bonds that would last lifetimes. Veterans of Bastogne, the Ardennes counteroffensive, and Patton's relief march formed associations that met annually for decades after the war, sharing memories of courage and sacrifice that defined their generation. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed changed World War II forever, but not in the way Hitler had envisioned. Instead of splitting the Allied coalition and gaining time for Germany, the offensive had accelerated the Reich's collapse and demonstrated the futility of Nazi resistance. The road to Berlin was now clear, and the Third Reich had fewer than 4 months left to live. In the snow-covered cemeteries of the Ardennes, where American and German soldiers lay buried side by side, the true cost of Hitler's last gamble was measured not in strategic objectives gained or lost, but in young lives that would never see peace.